You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR is radical radio, and that means more than just alternative current affairs and political coverage.
We're radical because we're an independent media outlet, owned and operated by the community.
We're radical because we give communities the control of their own shows, with their own music, in their own languages.
We're radical because we provide a media platform for communities to build their own power to create social change.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call us on 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. What's Anarchy is all about? Simply, anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people, as we see every day around the planet, inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve or share power, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Exceptionally conservative concepts which cause a lot of consternation by those who exercise power and hold wealth. A lot of consternation because means the end of their manipulation of us. It's very simple. That's why anarchists are so dangerous. We're dangerous because of the strength of our ideas. And the central tenet of an anarchist idea, of anarchism, is to remove the power of rulers, to ensure that wealth is held in common and used for the common good. Exceptionally conservative concepts, which if you look at many of the religious traditions that are still alive on the world in 2024, you'll find those concepts are part and parcel, central elements of those religious traditions, believe it or not. So, what have we got in store for you today? Well, it's going to be a little bit theoretical. So, you want to watch your local football team, do something on TV, go ahead and do it. But we're going to simplify things. And the whole point about broadcasting, or podcasting, whatever you like to call it, is that we're told constantly that life is complex. That you don't have the capacity to actually unwind it, that we need all these experts to do it for us. Well, life is very easy. Not in terms of living life, but in terms of understanding what's happening. It's very exceptionally easy. It's not complex. Let's look at Western parliamentary democracies, which we are part of. We are part of that scene. The Western parliamentary democracies, which are gearing themselves up, for a life and death struggle with the authoritarian elements in society, authoritarian sovereign nation states. And somehow we think we are different. We throw around words like freedom and democracy. Could you imagine that? Throwing around words like freedom and democracy. And the fact is that democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And that's the key. It's an engaged public. And what we find today is that people are not engaged because they understand in a variety of ways that what we have is not democracy. Every 3 to 4 years, you're forced in Australia by legislation to cast a ballot, or actually go to the ballot box if you want to be, have your name scribbled off, and to cast a ballot to elect a representative for the next 3 to 4 years to make decisions for you. Now, there are two problems with this situation, two very, very important problems. One, the person you elect does not have to honour one promise. It's all about faith. You talk about religious faith. Well, this is political faith. You've got faith in your representative that they will somehow struggle to make those policies a reality. And second, even more importantly than that, is that real power doesn't lie in Parliament. Real power lies in the hands of unaccountable people who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. We see this on a day-to-day basis. They determine the parliamentary agenda, not by tapping a parliamentarian on the shoulder and saying, this is what you're going to do, but in terms of the type of society we have created, where the private investment for private profit mantra is the single most important enduring political, social fact. That's right, in our society. It's a little bit like when you read a book. You read a book, it's got a general theme, all right? Whether it's a story, whether it's fiction, whether it's non-fiction, there's a theme. And then there are different pages that you read which really have very little to do with the central theme. So in Western parliamentary democracies, and I don't use the word Western democracies, I use parliamentary democracy because that's what we have. We don't have democracy. We don't have direct democracy. We have a parliamentary democracy. In Western parliamentary democracy, every one of those people involved, almost every one of the people involved in that process, are reading the same book. And in Australia, it's quite obvious they're reading the same book. And that book is based on the idea that there is no other way for human beings to survive apart from a private investment from private profit philosophy or ideology. And what we've seen over the last almost half a century, is that all the gains that were made during struggles in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century has been dissipated by a counter-revolution which has had a profound impact on each of every one of us, and we are now beginning to feel that impact, whether it's the climate emergency, whether it's the education kerfuffles we see today of HECS debt, destroying people's lives, whether it's access to public facilities. And what we've seen over the last 50 years is those gains that were made by hundreds of thousands of people and tens of thousands who died in that struggle to create a more egalitarian community are being rapidly washed away in a massive tsunami which we, that's right, you and me, have allowed to occur. And that massive tsunami has been based on the concept of deregulation. What does deregulation mean? They call about red tape, green tape, that's what they talk about. Deregulation is an exceptionally simple concept. It means getting the state to move out of the way of business interests, corporate interests. That's all it's about. All those regulations which were created in the majority of cases, not all cases, to protect the individual and protect communities, washed away. Then we have privatisation. Now, privatisation is nothing new. Those of you who've been following the lectures I've been giving on the political prisoners which were transported to Australia during the convict era, which was 1788 to 1868, during that period, that 80-year period, will note that privatisation in many regards was the very heart of the social protest movements which saw hundreds, if not thousands, of political prisoners sent to this country. And it was the privatisation of the common lands in Britain, as far as, Australia is concerned. And what that meant is that between a 60-year period, over 6 million acres of land, which had traditionally, since the Norman conquests, belonged to the peasants, to working people in the agricultural sector, which allowed them to create their own communities and which allowed them to offset starvation by being able to keep animals and, grow food, were given across to the landed gentry in order to force people to work for a wage, not just in the agricultural sector, but the satanic mills which were being created across England in the 1820s and 1830s. But what we've seen is a modern form of privatisation, and we pay the price. We've seen the privatisation of our essential services. Could you imagine that? The privatisation of this country's ports. The privatisations of a national carrier in the aircraft. The privatisation of telecommunications. The privatisation of social security. That's right. Been handed over to the private sector. Nothing different to what happened in the 19th century. Nothing different. So we are now the privatisation of education. So what we are now, early childhood development. I could go on for the rest of the program. I don't want to bore you. You know about that. So privatisation, what it does basically is it, how shall I put it? What it does, it adds an extra person to the marital bed. Instead of ménage à deux, you have a ménage à trois. Because every time a public asset is privatised, a number of things happen. One, the money which is made by that public asset no longer flows to the Treasury, so it has to rely on individual taxation. Two, what it means is that a huge layer of bureaucracy is now implemented to ensure that the private owners extract a profit from that relationship between the public and the government. I mean, the nursing home or the aged care fiasco, and every Royal Commission they've had into aged care has highlighted this, highlights what happens when in an essential service you privatise an essential service. And you've got a third party which needs to make a profit from that service and how it actually affects the people who need to use that service. And if you're waiting for a windfall from your elderly parents when they, people like me kind of move off the planet, well, the trouble is there's a lot of people between you and your parents trying to grab that money. And the aged care sector is a perfect example of what happens in that situation. So think about it. It gets even worse. Then we've got globalisation. What's globalisation? Globalisation is very simple. When you have corporations which dominate various aspects of society, whether it's food, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's mining, and you have a global economy, what happens is that these businesses try to find a place in the world that is good for business. What does good for business mean? It which maximises their profits. So they're looking for places which are non-unionised. They're looking for places that have low wages. They're looking for places that have authoritarian governments who are happy to, take a little bit of, a little bit of money in the back pocket and turn the other way. So that's what globalisation is about. So when you buy something, I was in a supermarket, sorry to say this, I was desperate, and I was looking for a packet of noodles, okay? And I came across a packet of noodles for $1.50, made in China. And I kept going along the thing, made overseas. That's what globalisation is about. And what's corporatisation? Corporatisation is the logical endpoint of an economic system where profit is the sole motive for an organisation, where there is no regulation to actually curtail the activity of that corporation as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful, as we've seen in the virtual world and as we see in the real world every day in this country, where there are no rules, although we're supposed to have an Australian Competition and Consumer Commission which has no teeth, paper tiger, as they used to say in Maoist China, which has no teeth. So we see the growth of corporations, which then dominate a particular sphere of human activity and then set the agenda, not just in terms of prices to consumers, but in terms of what they will accept from people who actually provide those commodities for them. So that's what we're seeing. So we're all singing from the same book, the same hymn book, okay? It's the same hymn book. Occasionally there's a different hymn. And that's what democracy has become about. It's become about identity politics. Nothing wrong with that. But that seems to be the central goal of everybody. Identity politics. It's become about, in the settler societies of Canada, the United States and Australia to a significant degree, about trying to work out some ongoing relationship with the descendants of this country's First Nations people. And that's what it's about. And but nothing else. Not about changing the type of economy that we have. Not about changing the fact that deregulation and globalisation and corporatisation and privatisation have enriched a shrinking number of people. I remember the good old days, which are now the bad old days, which we used to consider to be the bad old days, the good old days. You'd have millionaires. Now you've got billionaires. I'm waiting for the world's first trillionaire, which I'm sure is around the corner. So that's what we're seeing. So we're singing from the same hymn book. And the dilemma is that all the major political parties around the world sing from the same hymn sheet as far as economic management is concerned, as far as distribution of wealth is concerned, as far as production is concerned. It's about private investment for private profit. So no wonder the only thing we talk about today, and the only thing we seem to act on, apart from identity politics and politics that revolve about interactions and relationships with this country's First Nations people, is about the signs, the symptoms of a society based on private investment for private profit, where profits are being centralised and power is being centralised in fewer and fewer hands. We never talk about those structures which create this situation. We talk about poverty. We talk about HECS debts. We talk about interest rates. We talk about taxation. Some people even talk about modern monetary theory. But the fact is, we've now reached a situation where we believe as a people, and that includes, the great majority of people listening to this program, there is no other way. This is where public interest before corporate interest comes in. Now, public interest before corporate interest was established in 2015. And to say the organisation was on life support is no exaggeration. But it seems after a Congress last Saturday that things seems to be moving in the right direction, and maybe we're going to do a little bit of rehabilitation. Because it's time that we looked at things in a different way. What we're looking at in Australia today is the fact that we're interested in a minority. We're not interested in the fate of the majority. We have forgotten that it's about the fate of the many in comparison to the fate of the few. And what we've seen during this era over the last half century, where the gains of the past have been removed, is that the fate of the minority that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication have become the central focus of all our activities. And we've all become aspirational. We all aspire to be billionaires, but the fact is not everyone can be a billionaire. In a capitalist system, only a very minuscule minority get to that situation. So that's the dilemma. So public interest before corporate interest was established as a political party to raise these issues. Now, obviously, we're not even registered at a state level because of lack of interest. That's the reality. So if you are interested in things beyond identity politics, beyond symptoms, I encourage you to look at their website, because I'm the registered officer for that particular organisation, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, PIBCI, PIBCI.net. And if you're interested, join. Because hopefully by the end of 2025 we'll be registered as a Victorian-based party, and by the end of 2028-29 we'll be registered as a federal political party. Not in terms of trying to win parliamentary seats, but in terms of trying to change the debate that's occurring. I am sick and tired. For 49 years I've been a medical practitioner. And when you're a medical practitioner, it's not signs and symptoms that are central to healthcare. It's about making a diagnosis. Signs and symptoms lead you to that diagnosis. You can treat all the signs and symptoms you like with any medication you like. But if you don't make a diagnosis, you're never going to resolve that problem. And it's the same with the situation we find ourselves in today as citizens and permanent residents in this country. We can establish charities, we can do this, we can do that, to try to ameliorate the signs and symptoms of distress which we see in our community, and ultimately nothing changes. Or we can actually make a diagnosis and then try to fix the problem because we know what the problem is, and obviously there are various ways of trying to address that problem of making a fairer Australia, a fairer world for its citizens, and maybe have an impact on the rest of the world. But unless we are willing to address, to make that diagnosis, and that diagnosis revolves around the idea that we shouldn't be reading from the same hymn book and singing the same hymns as those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, or otherwise we'll just be continuing to deal with signs and symptoms, not with the real issue. And the real issue is very simple. We live in a society where everything is monetarised. Everything has a financial value. Even your kidney has a financial value. That's the type of society we live in. A private investment for private profit. And unless we are willing to tackle this and make this our primary aim as political, social, cultural activists, nothing will change. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. So, who are you going to call? Who are you going to call when your HECS debt is destroying your life? Who are you going to call when you lose your job because it's been, sent offshore? Who are you going to call when you've been fleeced in the aged care sector? Who are you going to call when rents keep increasing, mortgages keep increasing, and you're spending more and more of your income paying for essential human services? I could go on and on. Who are you going to call? Are you going to call your religious guru? Are you going to call your brother or sister or your father or mother? Are you going to call your friend? Who are you going to call? Well, don't call. Join public interest before corporate interest. Pipsy, go to pipsy.net and join a growing movement to create a fairer, more respectable Australia. All right, let's move on. It's funny, isn't it? Now, Mr. Putin, nasty piece of work. International Criminal Court has actually put out a summons on the lad, okay? Australian government, very happy to send ships to North Korea, around North Korea, to enforce an embargo, I mean, the North Koreans, nasty piece of work. It's major, business is oppressing its own people. But I actually haven't seen North Koreans do what's happening in Gaza. Yep. So, the atrocities in Gaza continue. The International Criminal Court sits on its fingers. If what is happening in Gaza is not a war crime, I don't know what is a war crime. Why is it that the International Criminal Court cannot put out an order against the Israeli cabinet for war crimes? Now, I know the International Criminal Court has minimal jurisdiction. It has no jurisdiction in the United States of America. It has no jurisdiction in Israel. It has no jurisdiction in Russia. It has no jurisdiction in China. But it does have jurisdiction in Gaza. Because what's happened to the Palestinian state is recognised by the International Criminal Court. And if the deaths of over 35,000 people in carnage, I never use the word war, this is carnage, and the majority being women and children and elderly, and the occasional Hamas militant, you wonder, what is a war crime? What is a war crime? Is a war crime something that is done by somebody on the other side? Our traditional enemies? You know, the Chinese Communist Party, Putin's Russia, North Korea, Iran? Are they the only war criminals on the planet? Or do we turn a blind eye when people on our side, in inverted commas, that's right, people on our side are involved in atrocities? Do we turn a blind eye? Shrug our shoulders, walk away, think we have no responsibility for what's happening? Because ultimately we all have a responsibility. And whether the International Criminal Court has any jurisdiction, where it has the capacity to enforce its orders, is irrelevant. What is irrelevant, that people who are involved in war crimes don't walk away with total immunity because they're on our side. They're our people. It reminds me of the Pol Pot situation in Kampuchea, Cambodia, previously Cambodia, when the Khmer Rouge took over and they were evicted by the Vietnamese. Guess who Australia and the United States supported for over 30 years in the United Nations? Guess who held the seat, the Cambodian seat in the United Nations? Pol Pot and his murderous crew, because they were on our side. So think about it. It doesn't matter if somebody's supposedly an ally. If they're involved in activities which are obvious war crimes, well then they need to be charged. Whether they get away with it or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is that there is that stain on their character. You listen to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Now, obviously there are activities around the country regarding the Gaza situation. I encourage you to look at what's happening and get involved. Let's move on. It's fascinating, isn't it? Remember that old saying, keep your enemies close and your friends closer? Now, I did notice there was a bit of a hullabaloo because there was a little bit of interaction with a Chinese fighter jet, I think, and an Australian helicopter off the coast of Korea. And the Australian ship and the helicopter were enforcing an embargo on North Korea, and I think some flares were thing, and it was almost World War III. Now, I remember a week or two ago about information finally reaching the public arena. So this is what happened when you haven't got a Julian Assange who's willing to, put information out on the net. It took 4 years for us to realise that foreign power that was involved in espionage in Australia was India. Our very good friend, the Indians. Wasn't that interesting? Our very good friends were the ones who were involved in espionage, not just in terms of keeping an eye on the Sikh community in this country, because they're concerned about their call for an independent Khalistan for the Sikh community, but the fact that they were involved in spying regarding security. Not only weren't we told, but now the whole story has been buried. And that's what happens, See, this is how the media works. It buries stories which don't fit the narrative. Now, our narrative as a nation state is very, very simple. Our narrative is based on the idea that we live in a democracy, that freedom is our calling card, and that we're surrounded by hostile, authoritarian regimes. That's our narrative, okay? Now, just in case you've forgotten, West Papuan refugees and asylum seekers in this country have been monitored by the Indonesian authorities for over 2 decades. But do we hear the Australian government making a comment about this? Do we hear the corporate-owned media make a comment? Occasionally you'll hear a little bit of a noise from some Australian Broadcasting Corporation reporter. But do we hear anything? When it doesn't fit the narrative, the story may appear for 5 hours, 24 hours, and then it just disappears. No discussion. But as far as our so-called enemies are concerned, well, those stories are constant because we need to create this sense of impending invasion, impending doom in this country. So we can get people all heated up about the fact that our democracy, our freedoms are going to be taken away. So let's look at our democracy, as I did at the beginning of the program. Our democracy, parliamentary democracy, is that really democracy? Is that rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public? When you've got over 1 million children from a population of 27 million living in poverty? Is that our democracy? Is our democracy a democracy where we allow our natural resources to be exploited by transnational corporations for a pittance when we could exploit them ourselves and, like the Norwegians, make billions if not trillions of dollars? Is that our democracy? Is our democracy when we have the schmozzle we see in the aged care sector, in the health sector? And so to a very large degree, this happens because of the climate which is created by a media which is either self-censored, as we see with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, well, self-censorship seems to be the name of the game, or a media which is corporately owned, whose agenda is to ensure we keep singing from the same hymn book. Unfortunately, I'm tone deaf and I don't sing from that hymn book, and I'm sure most of our listeners are tone deaf and they don't sing from that hymn book, but the majority of people in this country sing from that hymn book. See, that's the dilemma. It's the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. For example, the Bonza collapse, okay? 60,000 customers, 323 employees, I think a few hundred contractors, collapse. Why did it collapse? Very simple. Because the airports have been privatised. Therefore, large corporations can put pressure on the smaller players and bankrupt them as part of their, strategy to ensure they continue their duopolies as far as the aviation industry is concerned. It's just an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in when we cannot seem to see the trees for the forest, or the forest for the trees, whichever way you say it. Just an extraordinary situation. So is it a democracy? Is it rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public? Is it a democracy when the fourth estate, which is the media, is controlled and owned, whether it's social media or legacy media, by a handful of people? And in social media, It's all about getting your eyeballs on the shit so you can see their advertising. They can sell advertising revenue. Irrespective of the human costs, irrespective of the societal cost, irrespective of the cultural cost. It's all very well to beat ourselves to a pulp because of increasing misogyny in the community, but the fact is, it stems from a private investment for private profit model. The virtual world, advertising, eyeballs. The more insane, the greater the number of eyeballs. A very simple concept. All right. That reminds me, critical thinking. I've been thinking about critical thinking. I'm thinking, well, we don't have any critical thinking anymore. We have reactions, don't we? Things happen, we react. 24 hours later, 48 hours later, we forget. The same thing happens, we react. Whether it's youth crime, whether it's increasing insecurity, whatever it is. It's a reactive situation. It's a little bit like signs and symptoms. We react to the signs and symptoms. We don't look to the underlying causes. Because we do need huge structural changes which centre on economic transformation in terms of who owns what and what it's used for. I'll give you an example. That's why you need critical... See, critical thinking is basically a virtual filter. Because something appears on the net doesn't make it true or right. It appears on the net, so it can attract eyeballs. So therefore, they can sell more advertising or charge advertisers more because there's all these people looking at their bloody site. So critical thinking is a virtual filter. And you really need to be able to filter, whether it's the legacy media, whether it's conversations, whether it's the virtual media, we need to be able to filter the information we've been fed. And that filter comes from making a diagnosis about the type of society we live in and the steps we need to take in order to change that society. I'll give you an example, simple example. Now, everybody's bitching about increasing rents. Obviously, it's a very important situation because over 35% of Australians rent. About 30% own their own home, 30% are paying mortgages, and about 35% rent. And the number of people who are renting increases. Now, government after government have been using private investment for private profit philosophy as far as providing essential service, which is a house, okay? A dwelling, a roof over your head, security. Now, the rental system we have in this country is totally insecure because contracts are for a year. Now, if you're involved in a business and you are renting an industrial premise, you can have a 5-year contract with a 5-year option or a 15-year option, whatever. And the type of increase that occurs in your rent could be negotiated at a particular percentage or CPI. But when you're renting a home, you have no negotiating capacity because you can't get a 5-year lease or a 10-year lease because there's no legislation which actually forces people to lease properties in that manner. At the same time, 70% of negatively geared properties belong to investors who only have one home. And what's happened over the last 2 or 3 decades, financial institutions have been pushing people to invest in property because of negative gearing, which theoretically gives them a tax advantage at the end of the day. And obviously, if you own something, you rely on the escalating price of that home or unit in the type of market we have today. But the trouble is with a housing investor, if you only got one house, is you've got a problem. When interest rates increase, you'll find that that house has been, or unit has been mortgaged in order to access the negative gearing advantages of the taxation revenue. So when your interest rate goes up, because your tenant only has a 1-year lease, you can actually include that increase in the next year's rent. And when your land tax, which is a state tax, goes up, and it goes up every year, especially in Victoria, you can actually pass on that cost to your tenant. So if you've got the investor who's been pushed into this so-called investment because of negative gearing legislation, which theoretically gives you an advantage, and then you find yourself in a situation to continue that investment as interest rates go up and land tax goes up, is that you need to push that excess onto the people renting that property. So people are now paying 30, 40, 50, 60%, of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. So it's just, you've got to look at the situation. Now, the problem is that in this country, certain words have become so debased, they've become almost meaningless. Now, public, it just means people. The people, the public, the many. That's all the word public means, the many. Now, in this country, anything that is public is automatically assumed to be second rate, whether it's public health, whether it's public education, whether it's public housing, and the list goes on, whether it's publicly owned infrastructure. And it's assumed to be second rate for two reasons. One, to make sure that we continue to sing the same hymns from the private investment for private profit hymn book, that private is good, public is bad. And two, what we've seen over the last 50 years is a lack of funding for public assets, a total lack of funding. So when people look at public housing and compare it to private housing, they automatically consider that's second rate. When they look at public health and they've got to wait 3 to 4 years to get some type of, operation, and they look at the private sector where you can go in a week or two, to have your knee replaced because you've got private health insurance, we begin to think of the public sector as second rate. And we look at education, where billions of dollars of taxpayers' money goes to supporting the the private education sector, and little from the federal government, not as much goes into the state education sector. We see state education as second rate. See, the thing is about private facilities is they cherry pick. They cherry pick the more profitable elements of a business. That's what they cherry pick. A public institution has to take everybody. It's for the people. And if you don't fund a public institution, then you've got issues. And that's what we see. So if you get this idea in the public mind that everything in the people's mind, that everything that is public is second rate, it's bad, it doesn't work. And you get this other idea, everything in the private sector is good and it works and it's efficient. But the fact is that the private sector only works in this country because of billions of dollars of corporate welfare. Billions of dollars of taxpayers' money go into supporting private organisations to provide services that should be supplied by the state. So this cross-subsidisation of the private sector at the expense of the public sector creates the perception in the public mind that public is always bad. And see, these are the type of things that we have to struggle against on a day-to-day basis. because we continue to read from the same hymn book. There is no other way. There are no other songs that can be sung, no other hymns you can, sing to the praise of the Almighties. It's just an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in. And I'll go back to my original proposition. I've been a medical practitioner 49 years. Hopefully I'll complete 50 years. 49 years. And I learned very quickly there is no point treating signs and symptoms. Signs and symptoms are an indication of an underlying problem. If you put the signs and symptoms together, you can actually diagnose the underlying problem. Now, you may find that you can't do anything about the underlying problem and the patient dies. But in the majority of cases, you can do something about the underlying problem. It's the same in society. While we continue a private investment for private profit to support a private investment for private profit model, we will continue to have the same signs and symptoms. Why do you think a country of 29 or 27 million people can't even look after its own children? Why do you think there are so many charities in this country? We have charities raising money to send Australians' kids to public schools. Why do you think there is increase in insecurity? Why do you think we seem to be talking about the same issues over and over and over again, and irrespective of the government organisations which are set up to curtail the activities of the private sector? We find that these institutions which are set up by governments at the state and federal level, we find that they're not funded. They don't have the legislative teeth. They're paper tigers. Nobody was charged after this, the banking frauds which were exposed by the Royal Commission. Nobody was charged after the diabolical situation the aged care sector found itself in. We found the taxpayer moving in and paying part of the wages of workers in the private sector on behalf of a private employer. It's ridiculous. So forget about the signs and symptoms. Look at the underlying problem. Give some support to the people who are looking at the underlying problems, who are trying to make ultimate changes. To increase the number of hymns you can sing from the hymn book, or to create a new hymn book with new hymns which are based on mutual obligation, cooperation, collectivism, which are not based on a private investment for private profit model. Because, as our good friend Albert Einstein said, I think he said this, I could be wrong, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again when you know it's not going to lead you anywhere. And for us to continue to support the private sector, to support corporate welfare, to support, a parliamentary system which has no real power is ludicrous. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Melbourne listeners, don't forget that tonight we have the public interest before corporate interest dinner at Elysia Restaurant at the corner of Hope Street and Sydney Road in Brunswick. 6 p.m. to 9:10 p.m. All welcome. Those of you in Melbourne, don't forget the vigils on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House every Thursday, 12 till 1. Public housing, everybody's business. And the list goes on and on. Go to my Facebook page, Joseph Toscano. YouTube channels, Public Interest Before Corporate Interests. YouTube channels, josephtoscano.nam. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. And if you're old-fashioned, like me, you can always send letters to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052, or email at us at info@pibci.net. Have a look at their website, pibci.net. If you like what you see, join online today. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program has been coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name is Joseph Toscano. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Well, we still got time. Isn't that extraordinary? Well, I recommend you do a few things. Go to the YouTube channel, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. There's almost 300 episodes there that actually look at what the world's like today. Go to that channel now. Thank you once again. Listen in next week on your local community radio station.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.